What if I told you that Vietnam's revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh actually learned his game from black leaders in Harlem and Tariq? Nasheed used this fact to shut down a caller who claimed white supremacy doesn't exist. Just a few days ago, Tariq Nasheed, the filmmaker, author, and cultural commentator known for his unapologetically pro-black stance, hosted another one of his popular Twitter Spaces. For those unfamiliar, Twitter Spaces have become a modern version of the town square places where people from all walks of life gather in real time to debate, vent, share stories, and sometimes clash over ideas. And when it comes to Tariq Nasheed, the conversations are rarely dull. His name alone carries weight, and his spaces often become lightning rods for heated exchanges about race, history, politics, and identity. What makes his platform unique is the diversity of the audience it attracts. Contrary to what some might assume, his spaces are not echo chambers filled exclusively with black listeners who agree with him. On the contrary, they often draw a mosaic of participants, supporters, detractors, curious outsiders, and those who seem to join solely for the chance to challenge him. Some tune in quietly, content to listen and learn, while others wait eagerly for the opportunity to speak. This mix creates a volatile but fascinating dynamic. Every new voice carries the potential to shift the entire direction of the conversation. During this particular session, the atmosphere changed abruptly when an unusual guest requested the microphone. Unlike many who come in guns blazing, trolling, or trying to overwhelm with hostility, this person presented himself differently. His tone was calm, almost disarmingly so. But beneath the surface was a passive-aggressive edge. It wasn't what he said at first glance, but what his words implied, that made his presence so striking. Within seconds, the mood of the space changed. What was interesting about this guest was his rhetorical strategy. He didn't come in swinging the way some of Tariq's critics often do, attacking the very concept of systemic racism or mocking the struggles of black communities outright. Instead, he framed his point in a way that seemed clever on the surface, using logic that appeared neutral but carried undertones that everyone listening could sense. By avoiding the direct mention of black people, he tried to mask his intentions. But anyone familiar with these debates knew exactly where he was going. This is where the art of debate becomes especially important. Conversations about race and American globally are rarely just about what is spoken directly. They're also about subtext, about what remains unsaid, about the hidden assumptions embedded in a seemingly simple question. When someone chooses their words carefully to avoid outright offense but still manages to press on sensitive issues, they walk the fine line of passive aggression. And that is exactly what this guest brought into the room. He posed his question with a calculated precision. If Asian Americans, on average, earn more than white Americans, how can anyone claim that white supremacy truly exists? On the surface, it sounded like a challenge rooted in statistics, one that might even seem logical to the uncritical ear. If another minority group can outperform the dominant white population, then doesn't that disprove the existence of systemic oppression? To many, it might sound like a valid point, but to those who understand the depth of racial hierarchies, cultural differences, and the historical role of white supremacy, the flaw in his reasoning was glaring. Still, the brilliance, or rather the slyness of his tactic, lay in what he left unsaid. By highlighting the Asian-white income comparison, he neatly sidestepped mentioning black people, yet the implication hung heavy in the air. If Asians can outturn whites, then what excuse do black people have? He never needed to say it outright, because the silence between his words spoke volumes. It was the kind of rhetorical move designed to provoke without appearing openly hostile, to put Tariq and his listeners on the defensive without admitting to an attack. The audience caught it. Tariq caught it. Everyone understood the undercurrent, and the tension in the space became almost palpable. This is where Tariq's skill as a communicator came into play. He could have reacted emotionally, calling out the thinly veiled anti-blackness hidden in the man's phrasing. He could have shifted the conversation to defend black communities from the insinuation, but he didn't. Instead, Tariq chose a different route, one that not only disarmed the guest's argument but also revealed the shallow foundation it rested upon. It's important here to recognize why conversations like these are so significant. In today's world, discussions about race often get oversimplified into sound bites and statistics. People love to pull up income charts, crime rates, or educational data as though numbers alone tell the full story of oppression. But numbers can be deceiving when stripped from context. They don't account for the centuries of colonization, systemic exclusion, social conditioning, and cultural hierarchies that shape outcomes across generations. What this guest was doing, whether consciously or not, was weaponizing statistics to erase lived experiences. And that's why Tariq's response mattered so much. Tariq's decision to steer the conversation toward Vietnam and its colonial history wasn't random. By doing so, he exposed the cracks in the man's logic. White supremacy, after all, isn't limited to the black experience in America. It has touched nearly every corner of the globe, leaving behind scars in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, South America, and beyond. To argue that white supremacy doesn't exist because one group has managed to achieve certain economic outcomes is to ignore the vast and complicated ways power has been distributed and continues to be enforced around the world. At the same time, Tariq's restraints sent a larger message. By refusing to take the bait and defend black people against an argument that wasn't even voiced directly, he denied the guest the satisfaction of pushing the conversation into a predictable corner. Instead, he forced the focus back onto the broader system, demonstrating that white supremacy cannot be dismissed simply because one marginalized group appears to have beaten the odds. This exchange highlights something crucial. White supremacy is not a monolith that expresses itself identically across every community. It adapts, it mutates, and it manifests in different ways depending on historical context, geography, and power dynamics. The success of one group under certain conditions doesn't negate the oppression of another. In fact, it often reinforces the system's durability because white supremacy thrives by creating hierarchies among minorities, setting them against one another while maintaining its own dominance at the top. What makes this moment on Tariq's Twitter space so powerful is that it encapsulates a broader truth about conversations on race in the digital age. They are rarely straightforward. They are layered with history, implication, manipulation, and resistance. And for those listening, they provide not only entertainment but also education, a chance to hear the strategies people use to uphold or dismantle deeply ingrained systems of thought. In that short exchange, what could have been dismissed as just another online debate became something more, a microcosm of how white supremacy continues to be discussed, challenged, denied, and reasserted in modern discourse. And it's a reminder that sometimes, the real battle isn't over the loudest insults or the harshest attacks, but over the quiet insinuations, the subtle what-ifs, and the statistics wielded without context. Tariq's calm but firm redirection showed that dismantling those arguments requires more than passion. It requires clarity, knowledge of history, and the ability to expose the hidden messages behind seemingly innocent questions. In the end, what happened in that Twitter space was more than just a debate between two individuals. It was a lesson in rhetoric, in power, and in the ongoing struggle to name and confront white supremacy in all its forms. And for those who were listening closely, it was a moment that underscored the importance of vigilance, not just against outright hostility, but against the subtle, carefully packaged narratives that seek to erase history and invalidate lived experience.
So I want to have an honest discussion. Like I said, we can't really figure anything out until the truth is. I mean, I still love America. It's still my country. I'm still going to return one day. Mm-hmm. I know there's a lot of problems going on, but I just look at things unbiasedly. I don't want to, I believe like America is a fair system of meritocracy, because if white supremacy was real, then Asians wouldn't be out-earning whites per capita. They wouldn't be more educated than the whites per capita. They wouldn't pay more taxes and take less welfare per capita if white supremacy was real, which
This guest didn't take the obvious route. In his argument, he avoided bringing black people into the discussion altogether. Instead, he introduced a seemingly clever angle. If Asian Americans, on average, earn more than white Americans, how can white supremacy truly exist? On the surface, it sounds like a neutral point, but the implication is clear. By framing the conversation this way, he indirectly sets up an unspoken question. If Asians can surpass whites, then what excuse do black people have? His strategy was careful. He knew Tariq's audience and how quickly the dialogue could turn hostile if he openly singled out black people. So, he masked his real intent in a way that seemed detached but still carried underlying implications. Tariq, however, caught on to the tactic, and by the end of that exchange, he made it clear that if the guest's reasoning were valid, the broader conversation on racial dynamics would fall apart.
Vietnam.
Correct, yes I am.
You know y'all were colonized by France, right?
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about the past or anything that was, I wasn't alive back then.
Okay.
But I'm talking about like today's systems. I just don't. I mean, I don't see. I mean, yeah, there's white powerful people in charge, but there's a lot of foreign interests here as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think a lot of the problems you speak about, it has a lot to do with foreign interests.
Hold on, you're talking about the past. France just got off your ass in the 1950s. It wasn't that far. Yeah, you were literally dominated by France. France was whooping your ass until the 1950s. That's called white supremacy.
When Tariq pushed back by pointing to history reminding the guest that France had colonized Vietnam just half a century ago, Mann brushed it off. His response was simple: that was then. This dismissal reflects a common stance among people who downplay white supremacy. They acknowledge its presence in the past, but argue that today's world is different, full of opportunity, progress, and so-called equality. In their view, what happened decades ago has no bearing on the present. But beneath this guest's calm delivery was a layer of past. By not directly mentioning black people, he subtly implied that the same logic he applied to Vietnamese history should also apply to Black America. If oppression is in the past, then why bring it up today? Tariq, however, didn't fall into that trap. Instead of letting the conversation shift into coded attacks on black people, he kept the focus firmly on the point at hand: Vietnam. From there, Tariq posed a question that steered the dialogue in a much sharper direction.
This is why intellectual conversations are very important. Ho Chi Minh, who is that? Who is Ho Chi Minh?
The leader of the North Communist Party.
Where did he get his game from? Where did he get the game from?
Probably the Soviet Union, I guess.
No. He got the game. He was over here. Ho Chi Minh came over here to America. He was with black folks in Harlem. And he got the game from us. And went over there and stood on business for his country. Huh?
Yeah, no. I understand that, I understand that blacks have a long history and that Asians wouldn't even be here without, the 14th Amendment or...
At one point, Tariq shifted the conversation with a sharp question: what do you know about Ho Chi Minh? For context, Ho Chi Minh was one of the founding leaders of Vietnam's Communist Party. But what many people don't realize is that, during his younger years, he lived in Harlem. While there, he attended meetings of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. In other words, Ho Chi Minh was directly influenced by the black freedom struggle. He saw how white supremacy impacted black people globally, and that respect for their fight helped shape his own vision for Vietnam's independence. Tariq laid this out clearly, and it was a point that couldn't easily be dismissed. Now, here's the larger lesson. Many people argue that white supremacy no longer exists simply because certain groups achieve economic success. They'll say, if you can buy a home or climb the income ladder, then racial oppression must be a thing of the past. But lived experiences tell a different story. Let me give you a small example. I once stood at the front of a restaurant, waiting to be served. A black waitress looked past me and chose to serve a white couple behind me instead. Was that a personal choice? Perhaps, but it speaks to something deeper: the ingrained idea that whiteness carries more value. This mindset shows up everywhere, even in countries with few direct encounters with white people. In Uganda and Kenya, skin bleaching is widespread. On Ugandan television, lighter-skinned hosts are favored, despite the majority of the population having darker skin. Where do those standards come from? They're remnants of white supremacist ideals. The same patterns appear in India, Vietnam, Brazil, and the Dominican Republic, where lighter skin is associated with beauty, privilege, and opportunity, even in places where white people are hardly present. That's the key point. White supremacy isn't only about income inequality or formal segregation. It's a system of values, rules, and hierarchies that can be upheld even without white people in the room. It survives as a mentality through colorism, through assumptions about intelligence, through restrictions on relationships, through policies both left and right. On the political right, white supremacy can take the form of exclusion, discouraging interracial marriage, criminalizing blackness, or creating barriers to access. On the political left, it can appear as replacement, immigration policies, gentrification, taxation, subtler strategies that still displace black communities. Either way, the end goal is the same: lowering black morale and maintaining control. We've even seen this dynamic play out at the highest levels of power. Having a black president didn't dismantle the system. Barack Obama still upheld sanctions against Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. making decisions no different from his white predecessors. You can put a black mayor in Chicago or New York, but if they operate within the same structures, the outcome remains the same. Black leadership doesn't mean black ownership of the system. It often means acting as an agent of it. And here's the trap: believing that wealth or status exempts you from white supremacy. A doctor earning $40,000 a month, a successful attorney, even someone living comfortably in Africa can still feel the weight of a global hierarchy shaped by whiteness. If the mentality exists worldwide, you can't simply escape it. That's why the most dangerous sign of white supremacy's endurance isn't its loudest expression, it's denial. The most effective systems don't just dominate by force, they manipulate perception until people no longer believe the system exists. When someone says, "It doesn't exist, look at I've made it, I have opportunities, I don't see the problem," they think they're presenting a rebuttal. In reality, they're offering proof of how well the system works. White supremacy doesn't need to shout when it can convince its subjects to whisper, "Everything is fine." Denial functions like camouflage. It cloaks the machinery of inequality behind stories of individual success, making it harder to see the patterns. And the very people who claim the system is gone often unknowingly illustrate its power. Take Brandon Tatum or Candace Owens, two figures who proudly align themselves with conservative white spaces. On paper, they should be proof that racial barriers no longer exist. Black individuals rising in prominence, given platforms, embraced by powerful networks. Yet, ask either of them how many racist encounters they've had even among their supposed allies. The moment they step out of line, when their loyalty is questioned, the same people who once cheered them on don't hesitate to attack them with racial slurs and demeaning stereotypes. That's the contradiction. If white supremacy were truly dead, support wouldn't be conditional. But in reality, acceptance is often contingent on performance. So long as they uphold the script, they are tolerated. The second they deviate, the mask slips. Candace Owens experienced this most sharply when her personal life became a point of attack. For marrying a white man, she was reduced to an ugly stereotype, labeled a coal burner. Notice how quickly the conversation shifted from the content of her character, something conservatives often claim to value, the color of her skin and the intimacy of her choices. That kind of racialized attack doesn't emerge from thin air. It comes from a system deeply invested in maintaining boundaries around race, power, and belonging. This is why denial is so insidious. When people insist that white supremacy no longer exists, they erase these contradictions. They ignore the fact that even individuals celebrated within mainstream spaces can be dragged back into racial hierarchies the moment they stop serving the system's interests. Denial reframes oppression as personal failure, suggesting that if someone faces racism, it must be their own fault for not assimilating correctly or not working hard enough. But ignoring the system doesn't dismantle it. In fact, pretending it doesn't exist only makes it stronger. Think about any illness left untreated. The body might temporarily adapt. Symptoms may fade for a while, but the disease doesn't disappear. It lingers, spreading silently until the damage becomes undeniable. White supremacy functions the same way. It thrives when left unacknowledged, embedding itself into institutions, language, beauty standards, laws, and even unconscious behavior. By the time people recognize its effects, it's already shaped generations. Look at how denial operates globally. In Brazil, for example, many people proudly proclaim their nation to be a racial democracy, insisting that because the population is mixed, racism doesn't exist. Yet, Brazil has some of the starkest racial inequalities in the world, with darker-skinned citizens consistently earning less, facing higher rates of violence, and being underrepresented in positions of power. The very myth of no racism here becomes the excuse to avoid addressing systemic problems. Denial turns into policy. Or consider the Dominican Republic, where colorism and anti-blackness run deep. Many Dominicans will insist, "I'm not black, I'm Dominican." But that denial doesn't erase the racial hierarchy. It reinforces it. By distancing themselves from blackness, individuals hope to escape the stigma attached to it, yet the system that created that stigma in the first place remains untouched. This shows us that denial isn't passive, it actively perpetuates white supremacy by keeping communities from uniting against it. Even in the United States, denial has long been a political tool. After the civil rights movement dismantled legal segregation, many declared the battle over. "We had a black president," they say, as if Barack Obama's election erased centuries of oppression. But what did his presidency really prove? That one individual could ascend within the system while the system itself remained intact. Obama still enforced policies that harmed African nations, maintained the same power structures domestically, and faced vicious racist backlash throughout his tenure. His success didn't kill white supremacy, it simply showed that the system can tolerate symbolic progress so long as its foundations remain untouched. This is why denial is so dangerous. It confuses representation for liberation. It makes people believe that because a few individuals have climbed the ladder itself is fair. But white supremacy doesn't collapse when a black person becomes president, mayor, or CEO. It simply adjusts. It allows for exceptions while continuing to enforce rules that disadvantage the collective. The discomfort people feel when white supremacy is named is also telling. Why is it that conversations about systemic racism are so often silenced, redirected, or labeled as divisive? Because acknowledging it forces people to confront their own complicity. It requires admitting that the playing field isn't level, that advantages weren't earned equally, and that society itself is structured in ways that privilege some at the expense of others. Denial is easier, denial feels safer, and denial maintains the illusion of equality while protecting the status quo. But if we look closely, the system reveals itself again and again. It's in the school-to-prison pipeline that disproportionately targets black youth. It's in housing markets where black families are still redlined, denied loans, or given lower appraisals. It's in the corporate world, where black employees are underpaid compared to their white counterparts with the same qualifications. It's in healthcare, where studies show black women are more likely to die during childbirth because their pain is underestimated or ignored. These patterns aren't accidents. They're evidence of a system at worker system that many continue to deny. And here's the irony. The louder people are about denying white supremacy, the more obvious their fear of confronting it becomes. Think about the anger directed toward critical race theory or diversity initiatives. If white supremacy truly didn't exist, why would acknowledging systemic racism cause such panic? Why would teaching historical context be seen as a threat? Denial isn't just a perspective, it's a shield protecting privilege. That's why it's crucial to name the system even when it makes people uncomfortable. Naming it strips away the illusion, naming it reveals the contradictions, and naming it challenges the idea that success or assimilation can serve as proof of its non-existence. Because here's the truth, ignoring white supremacy doesn't erase it. Avoiding the conversation doesn't dissolve its influence. Denial doesn't liberate it. The system thrives in silence, morphs through institutions, and hides behind narratives of progress. And until people are willing to acknowledge it, it will continue to operate unchecked, shifting forms but maintaining its core purpose: to maintain hierarchies of race and power. The hardest pill to swallow is this: white supremacy doesn't need everyone to believe in it, it only needs enough people to deny it. Because denial isn't neutral, it's participation, and the moment you claim it doesn't exist, you've already proven that it does.